Okay, it looks like we have a very punctual group actually. So I've got everyone that registered is on. So thank you all for joining us today. Again, like I said, I'm Melissa Nunez, the Chief Operating Officer with Citrus, and we are honored to have with us our program evaluators that we've been working with the last few months, Multidimensional Education, Inc. And with us are both Doctors Michael Corrigan and Doug Grove. And would love to turn over the presentation to them. And then following, we'll do a quick question and answer. There is the chat feature that you all can send over some questions to myself, and I will share those with Mike and Doug so we can answer those at the end. But we wanted to thank both Mike and Doug for their time with us today. Through our experience in working with them, it has been an immense experience, and they are an open book of knowledge that they've shared with us, and we're incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be working with them now. And we just thought it would be wonderful to introduce individuals and organizations that we are very fond of multidimensional education. So Mike and Doug, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to the information you'll be sharing with us.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mike Corrigan. Hi, Doug and I are going to switch off here and there across these slides, but we've got a half hour or less than a half hour, and then time for Q&A. So we're both professors, educators, so we're used to talking long. So put together a short slideshow for you here to try to zero in on what we think and what we've discovered works when it comes to evaluating programs and pieces here. And by the way, Melissa can share this PowerPoint with you here in the future, as well as the video to share. But here are a few logos of some of our more recent and longtime customers. We've been very busy over the last, so we started MDed in 2008, but worked together for 5 years previous to that, doing a lot of research for the U.S. Department of Ed. And then 2008, we incorporated and started working with a great number of other individuals. We do a lot of research in K-12. We've also started doing a lot of work in child welfare as well. But we've also evaluated groups that work with adults. You know, what you'll find is MDed, you know, you're talking to Doug and I, we're the two that found the company, but we're a unique collection of professors, psychologists, and K-12 educators. We have a large team of folks we bring in for our different research projects. Here we go through some of the details, but we have experience administrating schools, coaching and teaching in K-12, as well as juvenile justice school settings. We've also evaluated and managed youth-focused organizations and nonprofits. You know, at our academic positions, we taught future educators, administrators, counselors, clinicians, you know, and our goal is always to teach them how to best lead, teach, and inspire youth. We're specialists in teaching child development, a whole slew of education courses, organizational change and leadership, as well as research methods and advanced statistical analysis. We've led the evaluation and program efforts for more than 20 million in federally funded research, and we've worked with around 155 state agencies and large organizations at this point over our time together. But our goal is to help clients become evidence-driven and evidence-based, since that is often a requirement for programs to be put in place these days. And I think what we do better than a lot of folks, or put a lot more effort into it, is knowing how to correctly measure what is being implemented, and also those variables that our clients need to show are improving. And that's what we kind of want to address with you today. Just so you know, we do a lot of writing, a lot of publication over the years. Here's a few of our books we've put out over the past 5 years. But today mainly we'll be addressing a lot what was written in Multidimensional Education with Corwin Press. What Doug and I discovered early on was that when you are looking to assess if an initiative or a program or a curriculum or whatever you're putting in place is having an impact what happens is you need to cast a wide net. And for instance, when we started assessing grants for the U.S. Department of Ed, we'd taken over one state grant, and they had been focused on character, and they weren't finding anything. And when we took over, we expanded it to school climate, and we expanded it to educational attitudes. And then we wanted to know how the faculty were doing and how the leadership was doing. And we stumbled onto what's called a multidimensional model for education. And the U.S. Department of Ed actually brought us in after our first year doing this and had us train 85 evaluators on how to better assess what's going on. And this is a lot of what we cover in this book here. But Doug, you want to take a slide?
Yeah, so this slide talks a little bit about some of our lessons learned, and I would say one of the ways we've learned some of our lessons in evaluation is we've been asked to step in on evaluations that had not gone very well for the first, say, 12 or 24 months. And so we had an opportunity there to learn from mistakes that had been made, and guidelines that certainly hadn't been followed in some situations. And so some of the things that I think we can best speak to today is to really think about starting with the end in mind. And we do put a lot of emphasis on coming up with a logic model for initiatives that we're going to evaluate, and really thinking through that theory of change. So we want outcomes. We're implementing things with students. You know, most funders want to see test scores. They want to see those kinds of things move and increase and go up. Maybe they want to see some other measures like climate measures. But we really encourage and we work with clients to think through, all right, what is it that we're doing that's actually going to get to that outcome? What's happening between what's being implemented and then what we're actually measuring at the end? The other thing that we take a large focus on is really determining implementation. And I think this is a place where a number of projects that we've looked at over the years tend to often fall short. And that is, you know, how much time is really being spent? What is the frequency and duration of the intervention? So if a student is in school for 6 to 8 hours a day, how much time is this intervention actually impacting the amount of time that that student is in school? And that's an important thing to look at. Not only time and duration, also, but quality of implementation. Is what's getting put in the way that it needs to be implemented?
Yeah, and we even also measure, we recommend measuring, for instance, a NSF grant we were doing with UC Irvine recently. We actually turned the training program into an online course that they could either get continuing education units for or college credit for. And with that approach, we were able to actually assess, was the training successful even, you know, to what level they learned the training. But a couple of the other things we really address is, you know, some of our peers call us psychometricians, and they stress the psycho because we actually develop assessment tools, and we teach stats and research methods. And one of the requirements to run anything beyond a descriptive statistics analysis, when we start looking at inferential analysis, like, you know, statistical significance, where we can actually infer something from, or predictive modeling, is that you have to have reliable and valid measures. And that means they're typically scales of numerous questions brought together that consistently measure what they say they're measuring, and also they actually are measuring that variable. They know that if it's a school climate, it's actually measuring school climate. So we've done a lot of work in validating assessment tools, either that we've developed or that others needed help with. But the goal is, a lot of times when folks are trying to have a new intervention be successful, they want to do a peer-reviewed publication on it. And for that, you have to collect the dependent and independent variables that are essential to the requirements to run analysis. And a lot of times we've walked in and we're like, there's no grouping variables here to use for deeper analysis, or the tools being used aren't reliable or valid. There are a lot of one question things like, did you like what we did, yes or no? And you have no variability to do any analysis on that. So we focus on truly improving the quality of data being captured. But as we mentioned earlier, you need to cast a wide enough net to actually capture what's being impacted. And you know, a lot of times folks think test scores, attendance, and behavior will do it, but as we'll point out here in a little bit, a lot of times there's a lot of challenges with that data. And if you study test scores, which we've written about for a number of years, the standardized tests haven't really moved since 1992. So it's really hard to find that evidence from time to time. But with Citrus, we're going to point out we actually stumbled onto something there. We use sound research methods. We try to get folks to improve their sampling techniques. It's always good to try to get a control group so you have another group to compare to, and there's ways to offer that intervention later after the initial study to the control groups. You need to be able to code the data so that you can actually use it for analysis. And one of the big things we'll talk about today is you have to get a baseline right when the folks are coming in, so that you have those pre-tests to do the post-tests on and show what's going on. And you could do multiple post-tests. So a lot of times, we won't have a lot of time to go into it today, but we want our clients to focus on process assessment, what they're putting in place, where they're at now, getting started. But also formative assessment gives them an idea of how things are going. And then obviously the summative assessment at the end is what we need to show what took place and how well we did. Sorry, Doug, you want to take over where I lose my voice this morning?
So what do all funding efforts wish to see? And that's obviously you wish to see that you are picking some outcomes and that those outcomes are being impacted by the program that's being implemented. The one reason Mike and I really enjoy working with organizations and foundations as well as schools is because there is a lot of altruistic motivation there. We want to see students improve. We want to see communities improve. We want to see families engaged. We enjoy that. We enjoy that work, and we actually do enjoy measuring those things and trying to help people most make the connections between their program or initiative, the implementation of that program, and what kind of things and outcomes should be moving or being improving based on that. Also in that, Mike mentioned there is a piece to that, which is, you know, intervention tends to improve as well. So one of the things that the data allows you to look at is how you might improve the implementation of the intervention. So we really, we take a structured approach. We look at curriculum, we look at services, we look at care, we look at approaches to well-being. We're seeing some interesting research right now related to distance learning, some interesting data coming out related to distance learning in a couple of our projects. And also, we want to help, you know, look for those positive outcomes, but really connect those positive outcomes to the logic and the rationale that's involved in the implementation of the intervention. So we put here a goal that has been proposed is implemented with fidelity, utilized by those who it is intended to reach, and a positive and lasting change takes place.
So what's the best way to know if what we're wanting to do is happening, right? One of the first things, as Doug mentioned earlier, if you don't have a logic model, we get you to develop one. And if you do have a logic model, we always offer to review it. And Melissa and her team can tell us that we've had a lot to contribute to their logic models. But and we've got to get goals, right? So when we figure out what your goals are, we can figure out what your research questions are or your hypotheses. Now, the other thing we strongly recommend, even if it's not us, is that you employ external evaluation, because too often when we try to assess it ourselves, there's this, you know, this perception of bias might have taken place. And there's also a chance that if you don't have an outside view of what's going on, you're not going to be able to really take a truthful look at what your strengths and challenges are. So one thing we try to express when we start working with the client is we're not going to change data. We're going to tell you exactly what it is. And our goal is to show you strengths and challenges, because really none of these programs work the first year, the second year, even like we want them to. So it's all about continuous improvement through evidence-driven approaches. Again, to just stress this, we try to get from the beginning, help folks figure out who are we sampling this data, how are we going to do the collection, what are we assessing, why, and how do we think these efforts are going to play out. We've mentioned before measurement of implementation fidelity, where we are encompassing the delivery and support being provided, because and this is important. I think I want to clarify too. We, numerous grants, numerous clients. In one state, we had 2 counties for the state grant from the U.S. Department of Ed. It turned out that the intervention county wasn't doing what they were doing. We got secret emails from principals and teachers saying they're lying to you. And it turned out that the county next door was actually doing greater work and actually doing more of what we were there to study. And luckily we had an implementation fidelity and measure. So we were able to show that when folks do this, here's what happens. But it turned out we learned that we were being duped a little bit, and we were able to turn that around the last few years of the grant, but in the beginning they weren't putting in the process. So we've got to find out, one, is the client doing it? 2, is it actually being implemented by who the client's trying to help? And there's a lot that goes into this, because if that's not taking place, the question is, what are we measuring? And I mentioned the formative, summative, and process assessments. This really gives us all the data we need to do the higher level statistically significant analysis for these positive outcomes. What do we mean by all this measurement and stats jargon? Well, if you allow a funded awardee to measure their own efforts and determine how they present their own outcomes, it creates that chance of perceived bias and embellishment. And I think as foundations, folks helping these groups do something, we not only want them to be honest, but we also want them to collect data in a way that allows them to really show what they're doing. So that's where this external evaluator comes in. You could have a whole collection of reliable and valid assessments in your library, so to speak, for them to use, or you can have them select those. But again, we recommend that those folks don't create their own assessment tools. We've worked with a lot of schools that had their own school climate assessment, and they were doing the assessment by emailing it to their teachers and having the teachers email the principal back with their name on it and tell them what they thought of school climate. Not only were the questions not enough, but the approach wasn't enough. So we want to set up the most sound statistical methodological approach possible, so that what is collected, we will know if we made change, right? And again, if we only measure a few variables we hope to change and we don't find evidence, it could mean that we just didn't measure what was actually taking place. So this is that wider net piece, again, we want to stress, is that it's so important to find scales that assess a number of different variables to put it into a survey that's not too long, but it's comprehensive. And if we don't have to survey all the time, we just have to survey at the beginning and at the end. It'd be great to do it every year. That gives us more information. And you can also do a random sample if it's a large enough group of people they're working with. You don't have to assess everybody. So there's some unique approaches here that can save a lot of time. In the past, in schools, they wanted to survey everybody. Our recommendation is survey 10 to 20% every 3 months, and you can keep a pulse on what's going on. Doug?
Yeah, I would just say, one of the things that has been really good about many of the projects that we're working on, at least in the last 10 years, is access to these online data systems. Different products like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Survey Gizmo, they've only gotten less expensive. And it really does provide a way for, for programs to be able to collect that data from the beginning. And that it's an important thing to kind of put out there as you begin to get your baseline, get a data system in place. And most of the students and the parents and the teachers, and I know they prefer to either do it on their mobile device or do it on their tablet or even do it on their do it on their computer. We recently did a parent survey actually, and we got, it was about 60% completed on mobile device. And so that actually increases the ability to gather parent survey data as well. And we've seen that increase through online data systems from paper-based surveys to online surveys. During our efforts, we typically try to help the client develop a sustainable data collection system. So if we're working on measures and fidelity measures and we complete evaluation, when that evaluation is over, that data system is still in place. And that data can continue to be collected, it can continue to be used to push out to the schools to give them a report of what's happening, or even to give a report of how implementation is or isn't taking place. For foundations, if you have a measurement system in place that your clients can use, it can help also collect better data related to foundation goals and how those are being met. And then much of these measurement expectations are often designed within RFPs or within proposals today. So it's so much easier now to put an evaluation in place, and once the evaluation is over, the client or the foundation or the organization is left with a sustainable data system intact.
Yeah, and they can use these for their next, if they move to another location, another school district, another town, another city, but it's all there to start all over. So one of our things is we don't like to come in, do what we do, and then they got to start all over after we leave. So real quick, before we end the proposal or the presentation side, I wanted to use Citrus as an example. And so Citrus stands for Character, Integrity, Trust, Relationships, and Success. And I've got a timeline here. It's a lot of copy, but you can read it, but I wanted it in there so you could follow the timeline. But they were in a state of transition at one point, and with some flexibility, they were able to look at their initiative and see what was going on. Some foundations they had spoke to felt that there was some holes in what they were doing related to the research. So Citrus was introduced to us through a mutual colleague, and we call our company MDed, by the way, about possibly helping, with the evaluation. So we heard what they had, we saw their reports, and what we offered to do was just start analyzing the data they had previously collected the first few years. What we discovered was that the surveys they were using were not reliable or valid. They also had a great amount of missing data that the evaluator must ran into some issues with sampling. They were doing paper surveys quite a bit too. Also, the survey they were using basically was only measuring the curriculum resources, the usage of the curriculum resources they were using to support the clients. They were not necessarily measuring the outcomes of what Citrus hopes to achieve with their initiative. And also what we were discovering is they only had a partial measure of implementation, so we couldn't really tell to what level the teachers and the schools were actually putting the system in place to some degree. It could have been better. So we found these methodological and measurement issues. We explained why the only results they had, to us it explained why the only results they had were a lot of percentages or ratios, which are fine. I mean, it's great marketing material, it's good information, but on the statistics front, it's lower level descriptive statistics is what we would call it. And what we were finding when we were doing the analysis after cleaning and coding and aggregating all this data from a couple of years was it just wasn't there to produce the statistical significance and draw inferences from related to the surveys anyway. So the data collected was not adequately measuring, in our opinion, what Citrus stood for, and we reviewed their program, and what they were doing was wonderful stuff. But we wanted to figure out, if we could show that they were making an impact on school climate or bullying or character, but those assessments just weren't in place. Their previous evaluator too had not collected data from a control group, and that's real important. So, I mean, you've all had the basic research classes at one point. There's an experimental group and a control group, or an intervention group and a control group. So those weren't there to compare on this data they collected on the schools. So we decided to dig further into using the state district data on absenteeism, discipline referrals, and test scores. Unfortunately, as you all might know, school systems like to change what they're doing every few years. And it turned out that the absenteeism and the discipline referrals, the way they collected the data had changed dramatically over the few years Citrus had been there. But the test scores were actually all there. So, and they were there for the control schools and the experimental schools in the district they were working. So after a month or so of aggregating, cleaning, and coding data, and then looking at test scores, we discovered this bolded statement right here: is schools implementing Citrus experienced statistically significant improvements in helping lower performing students improve ELA, which is English language arts reading. To us, this is your PBS statement, right? This is something that you're able to tell the world about what you achieved. And this is one you rarely ever find, especially after the first few years of implementation in developing a new program. So it was interesting to stumble onto this. And this was a good thing to walk away from. But we did provide Citrus with a lot of information and guidance on what was needed to improve. We've evaluated dozens and dozens, if not close to 100 of different programs and groups over the years. And we took the time to work with them on their logic model, but we try to see things more systemically and holistically, and that's what we were trying to do. So they ended up hiring us this past year to be their evaluator, and we began with the end in mind. We sat down with them and said, what outcomes do you want? We sent them assessments that we had. They picked a number of them. All these have reliability, and we validated them. And we put together a survey to measure those outcome variables. We also help them create better assessments to measure the level of training and the fidelity of implementation, to what extent the program is being put in place. We built all this into an online platform for them so they could abandon the paper survey approach. And by the way, they can take this from us and do it with their clients across the USA now. And we're now collecting data from an experimental and a control group. We're actively doing that. I'm sorry, I just watched Bill and Ted's new movie this past weekend. But if we could go back in time, the one thing we'd want to do is help them go back to year one, month one, and get a baseline. But we can't do that a lot of times when we come in to take over evaluation. But it's better to collect reliable and valid data and show how their schools are performing compared to others. And honestly, if we have a control and experimental, we can still show that their intervention schools are doing better, and that's what we will be looking for here in the near future. But we try to help folks, see that they're making a measurable difference. The view we try to give schools, because we want to not only give the program the data, but we also give the data back so that they can share with their schools what the data is telling us. So this is from a school district we worked with in Tennessee for a number of years. And it gives the school or middle schools a good look of what's going on. And the other thing, I don't know if you've noticed, but we typically try to triangulate because we think that's where the truth's at. So we collect data from the student or youth, we collect data from the parent and guardians, and we can collect data from the staff and faculty. And it's all on the same measurement. So we're able to see where they're at and how they differ. And these are the types of data we like to give schools, because not only do we want to be able to run the statistical analysis to give reports to our clients to consider publishing in a peer-reviewed journal or something like that, but we also want to give pieces to folks so that the school understands what's going on. And here you can see how the parents and staff and students differ on certain things. So the staff thinks the school climate's 4.1. The students are at a 3.0 and the parents are at a 3.7. So we see some halo effects often. And this is where we say, here's where your strengths are, but your educational attitudes related to staff, they're not seeing things as high. So we try to put things together, and for programs that hire us, we go in and do data training to the schools as well. Doug, we're almost done. Last slide, I think.
Yep. I just want to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing with Catholic Schools Collaborative in Los Angeles. And I think that two of our colleagues are on the call. I think Steve and Melissa are on the call with us today. But this is a really neat initiative. They have taken the time to put together the site-infused model for personal learning environments. They call it the simple approach. And the one thing that this started with back in 2017 is really working with them to look at kind of the key areas that they strategically work on with Catholic schools in the greater Los Angeles area. And when we started working on that framework, it really came down to these four different key areas of leadership, academics, families, and social emotional learning. And what they really focus on in this project is operational vitality. There's a real theory of change here that they've looked at that relates to understanding the impact of leadership and working with leadership first and getting leadership built up to capacity to then actually provide the professional development that teachers need, but starting with the leadership and building that leadership capacity to then be able to lead the teachers into the implementation. And one of the things that is unique about Catholic Schools Collaborative is they've aligned their measurement system to these four key areas. So when they look at, or they ask themselves the questions, what data do we need to collect? They determine what data they collect by how it applies to one of these four different areas of what they are providing related to professional development, support, leadership training, or academic program implementation. And so this is building on their theory of change. It's been really neat to work with them. They've seen some really great gains related to reading improvement. And they've had some really interesting findings related to when students have gone into distance learning and what we've seen as far as the technology base that students have been able to access. I would say one thing that's really good about the Catholic Schools Collaborative Group as well. They have become very data driven, and not only are they data driven as a group, but the schools that they work with, they provide that capacity for the schools to be data driven as well. So the work that we have done here is a little less along the lines of control and experimental work, but it's very heavy on the implementation. And that's probably the biggest factor that they look at across the schools that they're working with.
So we could go on forever, but I know we don't have that time today, but I threw out a couple other questions here, things we might have gone into, but if there's any questions from the group on what we've covered or anything else, or Melissa, I'm not sure how you'd like to handle it.
Yes. Hi, Mike. Hey, Doug. Thank you so much.
So we do have a question. Mike, you said,
yeah.
You want me to take that question? We have a question. It says, Mike, you said that you often step in when things are not going well. How does a funder know if the assessments are going well? What does not going well look like?
Oh, it's a good question. One that, you know, looking at, once again, if we're running stats on the assessments, you know, for example, when we teach reliability and validity, or when I do, I often use an example of how one item questions don't work. And that is, and I use it with my students. I'm like, so your significant other says, you ask them, do you love me? And they say yes, you know, or they say no. And even if they do say yes, what's that mean? They could be lying, right? What level do you love me? Would you jump in front of a car to save me? Would you change my underwear for 30 days? You know, if I was, you know, in need of medical care. And if the more and more we ask questions, the higher level we know their love is, you know. And what we try to do with folks is, the question is, what scales were used? So my first question we'd have is, what were the assessments? Are they actually scales? And scales are a collection of numerous questions, right? That measure a specific variable. So one, we'd want to look at that. Two, we'd want to look at, are they doing yes, no, which we don't recommend hardly ever unless it's a categorical variable that you're after. Are they doing like a 1 through 5? How are they collecting? How many people have they sampled from? There's just a lot of questions there as to if it's not going well. It should tell you, to what degree the program has achieved their goal, right? And if the assessments are actually measuring the goal, what does that say? And okay, it's achieved the goal. What's the outcome of that? So a lot of times when we look at things, I think you got to ask yourself, is this what we wanted to know from the client, right? Or from the person that you gave the award to? What more would you like to know? Would be the question. So it's a good question. We've came in before and done reviews of pieces of data being collected, like with CSC and other groups. So if you wanted, you could reach out. We could look at something you have and do a quick overview and give you some feedback.
I think a good first start, some funding level. Oftentimes funders are most concerned with outcomes and less concerned with implementation. And I think sometimes funders, when they see outcomes, they should be asking, why did that happen? How do you know, what took place to know that that outcome was achieved? So I think that's one of the basic questions that funders can ask as well. I would say not going well is when someone can't answer why the outcome is changing.
Yeah, or not changing,
or going down. So
yeah.
if the implementation question can't be answered, then I'd say the evaluation is not going well.
Yeah, and Doug, to your point, it reminds me of what we discovered. So a lot of our grants, we were doing longitudinal studies that lasted 4 to 8 years. And what we discovered about kids' attitudes was that the older they got, they're probably a lot like those of us on the phone, the little less positive they got in their views as they move forward. So we reached a point on one study that we wrote the report for the federal government on, was that the good news is the attitudes didn't get any worse this year, because what we were seeing in the control schools was where the attitudes were dropping year after year after year, and in our schools they were kind of remaining steady. So there's a unique as to what's not going well. We often need a control group to really know what that means, right? Other questions?
Don't see any others coming in. If anyone has a question. Oh, wait. All right, hold on. A few more coming in here.
And while you're pulling that up, Melissa, this third box coming down, we should tell you on a lot of our federal grants, when we were watching longitudinal studies, things often didn't work the first year, especially if it was a new intervention being developed for the first time. They sometimes didn't work the second year. It was normally around year 3 or year 4 that we really start to see change take place, because it just takes time to, change the culture, change the approaches, and help kids start seeing differently. And others, I mean, with the caveat to that, we've seen, some schools or different places change very quickly, but those are normally the more challenged schools. Yeah. So a lot of times what we do like to study are not the average schools, because the average schools seem to stay average, or the above average schools are already where they need to be. So it's oftentimes we like studying schools that are or facilities or organizations that are really working with the most challenged youth, because those are the easier ones to see if we're making a difference.
Mike and Doug, so quick follow-up questions. So you had said something about that change does not happen quickly. Can you elaborate? And how long, I think we're getting into this, how long does it typically take to see change occurring?
Yeah, and that's what I was just speaking about. But it truly, if you have if they have an intervention that's been around and they fine tuned and they have data on it that it works, and they've got the team that can go in and train and put it in place and make sure it's in place and being utilized, then sometimes those things can change real quickly. But for new initiatives, to our point, the first year is normally trial and error, right? Second year is, okay, we need to improve this, this, and this, and retrain. Then you got to overcome, well, the first year didn't produce data to show the group we're working with that it made a difference. So then you're dealing with some things there. So out of the dozens of grants that we've done, as well as the dozens and dozens of friends we've had that ran other grants that we've helped with, it's normally at least year 3 or 4 where you really start to see a paradigm shift in what's going on.
Schools, in schools, you're sometimes often up against other factors like teacher attrition and things like that you can never really, COVID, right? You're up against these things that you can never really factor in sometimes. But 3 to 5 years, because through year 1, you really begin to understand implementation. By year 2, you even understand better implementation fidelity. And if you have some consistency of the teachers that are implementing, then year 3 is the year you can begin to see results.
Yeah, and you probably should be following those same kids from grade to grade, because if you're studying a 3rd grade class and you study that for the first year and then move on to the 4th grade, the next group of 3rd graders coming in might not be of the same mentality and behavior as the year before. So when we're comparing just different samples in a certain age group every year, it's tough to do. It's the longitudinal studies where you follow those kids through a program are easier to tweak those things out. Sometimes it's just circumstance that a new group comes in and they give you better numbers. Doesn't mean they were better, they gained more, they just might have been better to coming in. I don't know. It's as a teacher, there's classes I am assigned that I think, God, if I can only have these students every semester, life would be wonderful. And then there's classes I get that I'm like, if this semester could only end in the 2nd week, it would be wonderful. So you never know what you're getting with a group of kids. And that's related to intelligence levels, that's related to behavior, that's related to how much trauma they've suffered previously and what they're bringing to the table. There's so many different variables, and that's all we really try to do is really just as we've advised dissertations and thesis students, as we've advised organizations, let's look at what you're trying to achieve. That start with the end in mind is something that Doug and I each heard from our advisors when we were going through our doctorates is, what do you want to happen at the very end? And let's start right there. Let's figure out what those variables are, those outcomes. You want to publish that study, right? What do I need to measure? Okay, I figure those out. I'm going to have a survey that does this. I'm going to have to do that. So we start here and we move back to where we're at. And when we do that, we're able to figure out, what's the best way of moving forward.
So for the sake of time, I want to just we have one more question, if that's okay, Mike and Doug, if you have a moment. And then, and obviously we'll make sure that your information's available and we'll share that with everyone that's been a part of this in case there's any follow-up questions. But so the last question, just want to throw out there is, what is the most common mistake that you see from organizations when they're conducting evaluations?
Mike and I might vary on this. I think Mike actually, the not starting with the end in mind is one of the biggest mistakes you can make. And just deciding you're going to go put something in place and not really think through a logic model. So the logic model helps you. You start with the outcomes, you build the logic model backwards. Really helps you understand why you believe what you're doing is going to have the change on the outcomes that it is.
Yeah, and that is important. I think I'm more the data cruncher of the two of us. And to me, what we've got to figure out is what needs to be measured and which kids are in which groups and how are we going to do these things, because if you don't organize that data from the very beginning, you end up with a bunch of data, and we've had this happen hundreds of times, it seems like, and you get the data file and you're like, well, who am I comparing? I don't have this variable, so I can't run this analysis. I don't have these different groups, so I can't run this analysis. And what we end up doing, instead of running an analysis of variance or analysis of covariance or a multivariate analysis of variance or covariance, we end up having to run a t-test or a basic means test. And that gets us, that's just not publishable in today's world. Is t-tests are the lowest level of statistical significance you can run. So if we don't really figure out with that end in mind, what data do we need and how should we collect it? That's one of the biggest things we run into. Is they're like, find results for us. Here's our data file. We've got tons of data, and it's unfortunately we spend a bunch of time trying to code and dummy code and cleaning the missing data out to get down to where we need to be, and it just becomes a real effort. So that's one of the biggest mistakes, I think, is not collecting data correctly from the very beginning and not following them. So a lot of times we get data where they're like, well, that was these kids, and then we've got these kids, and well, these kids are different from those kids. So to me, the methods and the measurement are the biggest mistakes we make if we're looking to truly show what we're doing and making a difference. And I think journals are looking for data like this. I should share, because too often our journals are filled with, thesis data and dissertation data, and a few studies. I've often kidded, just because I teach mainly grad these days, but for years I taught freshmen large lectures, and they'd run, at West Virginia University, and they'd probably run 8 surveys by me every year to kind of do it. And I'm like, I realized then that the vast majority of our research in behavioral and educational sciences was based upon, freshmen at a university level, which is not representative of anything. So I think journals are truly looking to see data like this from unique programs. So I encourage you to dig deeper.
Mike and Doug, thank you both for your time this afternoon, or this morning, actually, and this evening. Doug, for you, I think it's very early morning for you. I know you're 12-hour difference or more. So thank you both for your time, and thank you for everyone who's joining us today. We will be sharing this information actually online on our website, and we'll be sure to get you the link of that information, and also the website, and as well as, Doug and Mike's contact information. So thank you all for participating and joining us today, and we hope everyone has a great day.